So hello, I'm Lily. I'm a very new dev. Been programming for 18 months now. So just because you're not a super experienced dev doesn't mean you can't give a talk here. So consider it. All right. So, and the reason why I'm giving this talk is because I've actually been learning a lot about Ember through our legacy code base. And learning through a legacy code base has pros and cons, so I'm going to talk about that. Learning Ember is hard. It's hard because there's a lot of different concepts that you have to learn, and it's hard to teach because you have to figure out all those concepts that you need to share, and also because it keeps changing. So a lot of you have probably seen this before. This is actually from the docs, but Ember changes on a 6-week cycle. So every 6 weeks, the current master branch becomes the beta branch, the current beta becomes the new stable release, and then there's good semantic versioning, so you always know where you are in the release cycle. You can actually, I went on my calendar and I checked, was April 10th to May 21st, really exactly 6 weeks, and it is. It was very cool. So that means that bugs get fixed fast and new functionality goes in quickly, but it also means if you do have a big code base, a lot of people working on it, you might end up with things in there that are older ways to do things. Ember is great at supporting older ways to do things. It's great at slowly deprecating things. You always see that when you load your dev tools, that little deprecation warning, you know. So it slowly deprecates things, but that means that your code base can have a lot of old stuff in it. And as a new dev, you might not realize that stuff is old stuff. What if we could actually use all that old stuff to learn about Ember? That is actually what I'm going to talk about. I've got 6 examples, 5 of which I experienced personally, and 1 of which was suggested to me, of times that there's something maybe out of date or not the blessed path to do things, but you can actually use that to learn about JavaScript, about front-end frameworks, and about Ember. Okay, example number 1. I'm sorry the pastels are so hard to read. I think we will be distributing the slides later, so you can check it out later. But example number 1 is partials. So this is a screenshot of our message list. And I was working on, I think it was this little bit of it that I was working on. And that is a partial. And I found partials super confusing, right? They're named funny. They got this little dash in the front. It was hard for me to figure out how it was connected to anything else. It was driving me bananas. So I actually turned to Lorcan and I said, you know, what gives? What is the deal with partials? And he was like, oh, you don't really need partials anymore. I was like, okay, but why are they there? And he's like, oh, well, it's actually because in the early days of Ember, components were really expensive to build. So at first, Bootstrap had partials already baked in. And then just before the release of 1.0, components were added to Ember. And they just were really expensive, and they slowed down loading your page. So in a page like this, which has a lot of little boxes that could all be components, it would have taken forever to load. So we used partials instead. So just by asking, you know, what's the deal with this old thing? Why is this still here? I got to actually think about the cost of rendering the things that I put on the page. It's not something I would have thought of before. I would have thought everything was free, but it's not. It takes computing power to render stuff. Example 2 is actually pretty similar. So this is the href2 helper. And again, so we had 2 ways in our code base to create a link. One was link2 and one was href2. And as a new dev, I was like, I don't know, maybe there's like 2 ways because they're 2 different kinds of links. I don't know. So, so I asked, what's the story? And it turns out that href2 was originally a helper that Intercom developed because, once again, link2 was a component. And actually, each of these messages, if you click on it, it's a link to the message. So it would have been really expensive to render, once again. I think that href2 is baked into Ember now. Not entirely sure. You can tell me. So once again, by asking this question, I actually learned that all the things in our code base aren't necessarily just Ember ways of doing things. There's stuff that we actually built internally that I would need to know I'm not going to be able to necessarily look up docs on, or I'm not going to be able to Google, which I've done quite a few times. All right, so this third example is one that bites me in the butt all the time. So I used to be an English teacher. And so when I get in a situation where I have a property and I want to give it, be able to just call it by a different name for whatever reason, I always think that I should alias it, because an alias is another name for a thing. Every time I do that, Rory tells me, don't do that, because aliasing actually makes a two-way binding. And so I've got screenshots from the docs just to illustrate this. There we go. So what that means is if you use alias, so here we have both like a property that's called a name and the computed property called the nomen. And it's such a weird name. And you can actually get and set on both of them. So that means even though I would expect my alias to always be reading my name, I can actually use my alias to change that property. Gross, not what you normally want. Great, so then we have reads. That makes a lot of sense. I want to actually just read the value from that other, from my original property. That creates a one-way binding, so it's not going to go and change your original property, but it's not a read-only one-way binding. That's super confusing, so here are the docs again to kind of show it to us. So what that means is I've got my first name property and my nickname computed property, and you can see I can get my nickname, which reads my first name, awesome. But then I can actually do a set on my nickname, which changes the name. Wait, I thought I was just going to read my original property. Why am I able to change the name? Now the binding between those two properties is actually broken. You have two completely different properties now. So that was why read-only was introduced. Read-only is a thing that does precisely what I want it to do. So I can get my computed property, but if I try to set my computed property, it throws an exception, a really nice one, cannot set. You can't do that because this is a one-way read-only binding. So in this case, by actually learning the story, and for me it's a very kinesthetic thing too, by waving my hands and talking through it, I've actually made it easier to remember which one I'm supposed to use, so hopefully the next time Rory is reviewing one of my PRs, he doesn't have to tell me not to use alias. All right, fourth example, we're halfway there. My fourth example is Ember Model versus Ember Data, and here's where I really earn the history of Ember moniker here. So back in the day, once upon a time, Ember was a new framework, and it needed a way to deal with data, and Ember Data was the solution, right? So it was a kind of an ORM for the front end. The problem was prior to the 1.0 release, there were actually breaking changes made in it, and there were plans to make more breaking changes. That was definitely going to happen. So people who wanted to get up and running with Ember needed a solution that wouldn't require them to rewrite their whole app, and that's where Ember Model came in. Ember Model is super lightweight. You implement a lot of stuff yourself. And actually some people, this is really fun, if you check out this blog post from 2013, some people thought it should be the future. So it's kind of cool to look back at historical websites and see what people were saying about it. So now Ember Data is actually the supported happy path. And for me, I did some work on replacing some of our old Ember models with Ember Data stuff. And what that did for me as somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with like how programming works at all, I never thought about the way you'd have to manage your data on the front end. I'd only experienced it on the back end. And if I had been able to just use Ember Data without ever having to think about, ooh, I have to change it, there's actually something more complicated going on here, it might not have occurred to me that there was an entire concept I was missing out on. So yeah, we have this legacy code, and sometimes it's sort of annoying, but for a new dev, I actually managed to learn a lot about how front-end programming works from it. Okay. This is the hand-wavy version of classic and closure actions. So this is the only one that I don't have direct experience with. Pat introduced me to this idea for my talk. So once upon a time, again, back in the day, we had classic actions. And the way a classic action works is you imagine you have a grandparent component, a parent component, and a child component, right? Your grandparent component has an action in the actions hash, and your child component wants to call that action. Could be that you have a button here, probably a button. It has to call the action all the way up there. With classic actions, you click your button, it says action save. Oh, I don't actually have that action. Cool, I'm gonna bubble up and see if my parent has it. Parent doesn't have it, we're gonna bubble up and see if the grandparent has it. There it is, great. Closure actions, instead of sending, just using a string, you're actually sending the action and the context down. So the action called save is what this child component gets, not just a string save. And the thing that is really interesting about this is that it makes the way you debug completely different. So I knew from my studies about like runtime and compile time on the back end, but it hadn't occurred to me that there were like similar concepts on the front end. So with a classic action, if I have a typo in one of these strings, and I click my button, well, I won't actually see an error when I load my page. When I click my button and no action fires, I'll know something's wrong, and I have to go figure out where my typo is or what went wrong. With a closure action, as soon as I load my page and I've got my dev tools open, I'll see, whoops, there's something wrong with my actions. I can't find that action, so I probably have a typo or something like that. So it's sort of like compile time debugging, which is just a neat way for me to think about the different kinds of debugging I'm going to do on the front end. All right, last one, fixtures versus factories. So once again, when I first joined Ember, when I first joined Intercom, I wouldn't know if I saw in our testing base we had fixtures and factories, and I actually didn't say this during any of my practice talks, but I literally thought that fixtures had a specific purpose, which was for like mocking an endpoint, and that factories had a specific purpose, which was just for models, and they both had to be used independently of each other, because otherwise why would we have both of them in our code base? That's not true. So fixtures, it turns out, here's an example, there we go, are just like a static document, right? So I imagine this like counts one, all live, pause, draft, and you just type in all the mocking of your model. And what I did here was deliberate. You'll notice that all has 10, and live and pause and draft have 5, and 5 plus 5 plus 5 is not 10. And that's because I've seen that before. So you can put stuff that actually doesn't make sense in your fixture as well. So factories actually instantiate your model. So I went with the classic like animal vet metaphor that people always use. So here I'm instantiating a model, animal, and then I'm giving it this cool little thing where it can generate some names for me automatically. That's neat. And then I'm giving it this trait. So the default animal is a dog named Spot. But if I say, factory guy, make animal, cat, it's going to make me a cat named Fluffy, which is very cool. You might use Mirage if you don't use factory guy for your factories. There we go. So, okay, what did I actually learn from that? The thing with factories is that they're ridiculously easy to use, and you can pretty much just, if you have a lot of testing already in your code base, you can kind of just go look and see like, oh, this says, make animal, comma, quote, cat, quote. Cool, I'm just going to try different kinds of English words and see if they work with this factory. But because we actually had fixtures and factories, I had to do a bit more thinking to understand what they were doing, how they work, and which one I was going to reach for at different times. So the big takeaways, if you're learning Ember, ask a lot of questions about things you see, especially things you see repeated or done in lots of different ways. Look at the history. Maybe it's just because I'm a liberal arts kid at heart, but I love going back and seeing what people were thinking and what questions they were trying to answer when they came up with new ways of doing things. And just understanding the story helps me remember stuff. If you're a teacher, it's not a bad idea to have a list of app-specific modifications, stuff that's going to make code modding difficult for your app, for example, and also keeping a list of tech debt. To you, it might just be annoying tech debt, but to a learner, it could be an opportunity to actually understand fundamentally what's happening with front-end development. So my takeaway, remember, noobs don't know the difference between old Ember, new Ember, and you Ember. Thanks. These people let me practice my talk. Thank you.